General Vivian Marshall stands silently, staring at the silver handcuffs biting into her wrists. Her military uniform adorned with 4 stars means nothing to these officers. One glance at her phone displays the Pentagon's number. They have no idea what hurricane they've just unleashed. Before we dive into this shocking true story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If this kind of injustice makes your blood boil, hit that like button and subscribe to see more stories of brave individuals standing up against discrimination. Now, let's rewind to see how a respected military leader found herself in handcuffs and what happened when she fought back. The morning sun glinted off the 4 silver stars adorning General Vivian Marshall's uniform as she adjusted it in the mirror of her modest suburban home. At 52, her face carried the quiet dignity of someone who had spent 3 decades breaking barriers in the United States military. Her dark skin was marked with subtle lines that spoke of both laughter and hardship, while her close-cropped hair showed threads of silver against black. Every morning, she carried the weight of being one of only 3 black female 4-star generals in American military history. Today was particularly significant. As commander of the Eastern Strategic Command, General Marshall was scheduled to present her security assessment at a civilian strategy meeting in Oak Ridge County, a predominantly white suburb 30 minutes from her home. The president himself would be briefed on her findings tomorrow. "Military excellence is in our blood," her father used to say. Vivian grew up in a small house in Atlanta, Georgia, with faded photographs of her father in Vietnam and her grandfather in Korea adorning the walls. Both men had served with distinction despite facing the cruel paradox of fighting for a country that didn't treat them as equals. Her grandfather, Master Sergeant James Marshall, had served in a segregated unit in Korea, earning a Bronze Star that the military initially hesitated to award. Her father, Colonel Robert Marshall, flew helicopter rescue missions in Vietnam, saving 37 soldiers while enduring racial slurs from some of the very men he rescued. "Remember who you are and why you serve," her father had told her when she left for West Point, becoming one of only 25 black women in her class of 1,200 cadets. The memory brought a smile to her face as she picked up the small, brass compass he had given her that day. She still carried it everywhere. Vivian's rise through the ranks had been nothing short of extraordinary, though it came with battles fought not just on military fronts, but in the corridors of power. At West Point, she'd graduated in the top 5% despite a faculty advisor who expressed concerns about her ability to command respect. During her first deployment to Iraq, a colonel had mistaken her for administrative staff 3 times in 1 week, despite her combat insignia. When she became the first black woman to command a combat battalion, anonymous notes appeared in her quarters suggesting she had been promoted to fill a quota. Each barrier only strengthened her resolve. Each insult became fuel for excellence. She outperformed, outthought, and outworked every expectation, making it impossible for even her harshest critics to deny her capabilities. By her 40th birthday, Marshall had become a 1-star general. By 45, she had 2 stars. Now, at 52, the 4 stars on her uniform represented not just her personal achievement, but the dreams of every black girl who wondered if there was a place for her in America's military leadership. Today's meeting would bring together military strategists and civilian leaders to discuss emerging threats along the eastern seaboard. General Marshall had prepared a comprehensive assessment that would likely reshape security protocols for the next decade. Her driver had offered to take her in the official military vehicle, but Marshall preferred to drive herself in her personal sedan for civilian meetings. It was a small gesture that often helped bridge the gap between military and civilian perspectives. Keep a low profile, discuss the issues frankly, and build consensus, she reminded herself as she gathered her classified documents into a secure briefcase. Her approach had always been to lead with competence rather than authority, though she carried both in abundance. On her way to the meeting, Marshall decided to stop at a local coffee shop. It was a small gesture she often made, bringing coffee for meeting participants to create a more collaborative atmosphere. The young barista did a double take when she saw the 4 stars on Marshall's uniform but recovered quickly. "It's an honor to serve you, General," the young woman said, her voice carrying genuine respect. "The honor is mine," Marshall replied, with a warm smile. "You're up working before dawn to keep the rest of us functioning. That's service too." As she carefully balanced the drink carrier with 8 coffees, Marshall slid back into her sedan, placing the carrier securely in the passenger seat. The drive to Oak Ridge County was pleasant, with autumn leaves creating a canopy of red and gold along the highway. Marshall used the time to mentally review her presentation points, occasionally glancing at the secure phone that connected her directly to the Pentagon. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Admiral William Hayes had texted earlier, "Looking forward to your assessment. POTUS especially interested in your recommendations on port security." 20 minutes into her drive, as she entered the upscale community of Oak Ridge, Marshall noticed something in her rearview mirror. 2 police cruisers had appeared behind her, lights suddenly flashing. Her first thought wasn't alarm, but mild annoyance at the delay. In 30 years of military service across 4 continents, she had faced greater challenges than a routine traffic stop. She signaled and pulled over smoothly, keeping both hands visible on the steering wheel, as she had always taught young black officers to do during traffic stops. "Procedure keeps you safe," she would tell them, "even when you've done nothing wrong." Through her mirror, she watched 2 officers approach, one on each side of her vehicle. Their hands rested near their weapons in a way that struck her as unnecessarily cautious. Still, Marshall remained calm. Once they saw her military ID and understood who she was, professional courtesy would prevail. That's how these interactions had always resolved in the past. The officers approached with stern expressions that didn't soften when they observed her uniform. The one at her window was young, perhaps 30, with close-cropped blonde hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to look through her rather than at her. "License and registration," he demanded without preamble, no ma'am or acknowledgement of her rank. "Of course, officer," Marshall replied evenly, maintaining her composure. "May I ask what this is about?" The officer's face hardened. "License and registration first." Something in his tone triggered Marshall's finely tuned instincts for danger. This wasn't routine. This wasn't respect for either law enforcement or military authority. This was something else entirely. As she reached slowly for her documents, Marshall caught sight of the officer's nameplate, Winters. On the passenger side stood another officer, Donovan, watching her with the same suspicious glare. Neither seemed impressed or even acknowledging. Of the 4 stars on her uniform, "I'm General Vivian Marshall, Eastern Strategic Command," she said, handing over her military ID and driver's license along with her registration. "I'm heading to a security briefing with civilian authorities. If there's an issue with my driving, I'd appreciate knowing what it is." Officer Winters examined her ID with a skepticism that bordered on contempt. "General, huh?" he said in a tone that managed to make her rank sound like a costume rather than an earned position of authority. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," Officer Donovan suddenly instructed from the passenger window. Marshall's training in crisis management kicked in, and something was very wrong, but escalation would only make it worse. "May I ask why I'm being asked to exit my vehicle, Officer Donovan? I'm not aware of any traffic violation I've committed." "We have reports of a shoplifter matching your description," Officer Winters said. "We need you to step out of the car." The absurdity of the statement momentarily stunned Marshall into silence. A shoplifter matching her description? A 52-year-old woman in a full military dress uniform with 4 stars, driving a registered government vehicle? Before she could formulate a response that wouldn't sound confrontational, Officer Winters had already opened her door. "Out of the vehicle now, ma'am. This is your final warning." Marshall noticed people slowing their cars to watch the incident. A young black teenager on a bicycle had stopped entirely, his expression a mixture of concern and resigned recognition. She'd seen that look before, the look of someone who knows exactly what's happening because they've experienced it themselves. As Marshall carefully exited her vehicle, standing tall in her full uniform, she realized that the 4 stars on her shoulders, earned through decades of service, sacrifice, and excellence, offered no protection against what was unfolding. The coffee she had bought for the meeting participants would grow cold. The president's security briefing would wait. Right now, to these officers, she wasn't General Marshall of the United States Armed Forces. She was just another black person, deemed suspicious in a neighborhood where they believed she didn't belong. "Place your hands where I can see them," Officer Ryan Winters ordered, his right hand resting on his holstered weapon. The morning sun caught his badge, momentarily blinding General Marshall as she complied with his command. "Officers, there seems to be a misunderstanding," Marshall said, maintaining the calm, authoritative tone that had served her through international conflicts and Pentagon power struggles. "I am General Vivian Marshall, commander of the Eastern Strategic Command. I'm en route to a classified security briefing." Officer Brad Donovan circled around the car, his expression unchanged by her words. "We received a report of a suspect matching your description. Approximately 50 years old, black female, driving a dark sedan." Marshall took a measured breath. The description was so vague, it could match thousands of women. "Officers, my military. ID clearly identifies me. You can verify my identity with a simple call." A small crowd had begun to gather across the street. Several people had their phones out, recording the interaction. Among them, the young black teenager who had stopped. His bike watched with an expression that suggested he'd seen this scene play out before. "Your ID could be fake," Officer Winters said dismissively. "We've seen military impersonators before." The statement was so absurd that Marshall nearly laughed. "Officer Winters, I'm wearing a full dress uniform with the appropriate rank insignia. This isn't something you purchase at a costume shop." Again, a simple call to verify my identity would resolve this matter. "Ma'am, we need you to step toward the back of the vehicle now," Donovan cut in, his tone hardening. "Keep your hands where we can see them." Marshall complied, moving with deliberate slowness. 30 years of military training had taught her to recognize dangerous situations, and despite the badges these men wore, every instinct told her she was in one now. As she moved toward the rear of her car, she noticed more onlookers gathering. Phones recorded from every angle. In the distance, another police car approached. "I want to be clear, officers. I am complying with your instructions while registering my objection to this treatment," Marshall stated clearly, knowing the bystanders' videos would capture her words. "I've identified myself as a United States general officer, and you have not stated any reasonable suspicion for this detention." Officer Winters' face flushed red. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." "Am I under arrest?" Marshall asked, standing her ground. "If so, I have the right to know the charges." "This is your final warning," Winters said, his hand now fully gripping his weapon. In that moment, Marshall faced the same calculation that millions of black Americans confront daily: assert her rights and risk escalation, or comply with unjust treatment and live to fight another day. As a military strategist, she understood when to advance and when to tactically retreat. "I am complying." "Under protest," she said clearly, turning around slowly. "I want it on record that I have identified myself properly, and you have given no legitimate reason for this detention." As Officer Winters roughly grabbed her wrists, memories flashed through Marshall's mind. Her grandfather returning from Korea to a segregated bus station. Her father being refused service at a restaurant while in uniform. Her own experiences of having to prove herself repeatedly, where her white male counterparts were presumed competent. The third police car pulled up, and a younger officer stepped out. Lieutenant Derek Simmons, according to his nameplate, approached with a more measured demeanor. "What's the situation here?" he asked, taking in the scene with growing concern as he recognized the stars on Marshall's uniform. "Potential shoplifting suspect," Donovan replied. "Matches the description from the Oak Ridge Plaza report." Lieutenant Simmons looked from Marshall's uniform to her calm, dignified expression, and back to his fellow officers with visible confusion. "You're detaining a military officer in full uniform?" "She claims to be military," Winters said dismissively. "We're just doing our job until we can verify." Simmons stepped closer, examining Marshall's insignia with appropriate respect. "Ma'am, are you really a 4-star general?" "I am General Vivian Marshall, United States Army, current commander of Eastern Strategic Command," she replied, maintaining her composure, despite the handcuffs now being tightened around her wrists. "I was on my way to a classified security briefing when your officer stopped me without cause." Lieutenant Simmons's expression shifted to alarm. "Officers, I think we need to follow procedure," interrupted a new voice. A sergeant had arrived, his nameplate reading Blackwell. older than the others with a weathered face and an air of unquestionable authority. Sergeant James Blackwell surveyed the scene with narrow eyes. "What's the situation here, Winters?" "Shoplifting suspect, Sarge. Claims to be military but won't cooperate with verification." Blackwell gave Marshall a dismissive once-over. "Military, huh? Let me guess. Borrowed your husband's uniform for some kind of stunt?" The casual sexism, layered over the already blatant racism, didn't surprise Marshall. She'd encountered this toxic combination throughout her career. "Sergeant Blackwell, I am General Vivian Marshall. These are my earned rank insignia, not borrowed. A simple verification call would resolve this matter immediately." "We'll verify at the station," Blackwell decided, ignoring Lieutenant Simmons's increasingly concerned expression. "Load her up." The young black teenager watching from across the street looked away, his expression a mixture of anger and helplessness. Marshall caught his eye and gave him a small, dignified nod. The message was clear. "I see you. I know. This isn't right." "Sergeant," Simmons attempted once more, "perhaps we should verify her identity before taking her in. If she is who she says she is, then she can clear it up at the station." Blackwell cut him off. "Protocol is protocol. We've had 3 shoplifting incidents in Oak Ridge Plaza this month. We're taking all reports seriously." As they prepared to place her in the back of the police car, Marshall made one request. "Before you take me anywhere, I need to make a call. It's my right." Officer Winters smirked. "Calling your lawyer already?" "Something like that," Marshall replied calmly. "My phone is in my right uniform pocket. I'm not resisting in any way, but I need to make this call now." Sergeant Blackwell nodded to Winters, who retrieved Marshall's phone with unnecessary roughness. "Make it quick," he said mockingly. "Your lawyer can't help you anyway." With her hands cuffed behind her back, Marshall couldn't hold the phone herself. "It's unlocked. Please dial the highlighted contact labeled JCS Direct and put it on speaker." Officer Winters complied with a dismissive eye roll, clearly expecting to hear a panicked family member or an overpriced attorney. What he didn't realize was that JCS Direct stood for Joint Chiefs of Staff Direct Line. As the call connected, Marshall maintained eye contact with Sergeant Blackwell, watching his expression as a crisp military voice answered. "Chairman's office, Colonel Rivera speaking. Go ahead, General Marshall." The atmosphere shifted imperceptibly. Lieutenant Simmons's eyes widened in recognition. Officer Donovan froze in place. Only Sergeant Blackwell maintained his dismissive demeanor. "Colonel, this is General Marshall," she said clearly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding thousands. "I'm currently being detained by Oak Ridge County Police without cause. I'm handcuffed and about to be transported to their station. Please inform the chairman and initiate Protocol 7. There was a brief silence before Colonel Rivera responded with military efficiency. "Understood, General. Initiating Protocol 7 immediately. Do you require emergency extraction?" "Negative, Colonel. Just the standard protocol response will suffice. I'll call again when I reach the station." "Acknowledged, General. The chairman will be notified immediately." As Officer Winters ended the call, his previously smug expression had faded, replaced by uncertainty. Lieutenant Simmons looked like he might be physically ill. "This is still procedure," Sergeant Blackwell insisted, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "We can sort this out at the station. Load her up." As they guided Marshall toward the police car, the crowd of onlookers had grown larger. Dozens of phones recorded the sight of a 4-star general in handcuffs being placed in the back of a police cruiser. The young black teenager still watched, but his expression had changed. There was still anger, still recognition of the injustice. But now there was also something else. The glimmer of hope that comes from seeing someone with power face the same injustice you faced, and knowing they might actually have the ability to fight back. The police cruiser's backseat smelled of stale sweat and industrial cleaner. General Vivian Marshall sat upright despite the handcuffs digging into her wrists, her military bearing undiminished by her surroundings. Through the partition she could see Officer Winters and Lieutenant Simmons' intense conversation, Simmons repeatedly glancing back at her with growing concern. This wasn't Marshall's first experience with racial profiling. As the cruiser pulled away from the curb, memories surfaced from decades of similar moments, less public perhaps, but no less unjust. 1992. Second Lieutenant Marshall, fresh from West Point, stopped while jogging near base, asked to prove she lived in the officers' quarters. 1999. Major Marshall questioned by hotel security while attending a military conference despite wearing her uniform. 2008. Colonel Marshall, followed by store detectives while shopping for her niece's birthday present. Each incident had been humiliating in its own way, but Marshall had always channeled that humiliation into determination. Turn pain into purpose, her father had taught her. Today would be no different. Outside the car windows, Oak Ridge County presented a tableau of manicured lawns and expensive homes. Several residents paused their morning routines to stare as the police cruiser passed. What did they see? Marshall wondered. A criminal? A threat? Or simply someone who didn't belong in their neighborhood? The cruiser radio crackled with coded communications, but Marshall caught fragments that suggested her identity was already causing ripples through the department. Confirmed status of Eastern Command. Verification requested. Lieutenant Simmons turned in his seat. General, I want to apologize for this situation. We're trying to get it resolved quickly. Before Marshall could respond, Officer Winters cut in sharply. No conversation with the suspect, Lieutenant. His voice carried the edge of someone beginning to realize they might have made a catastrophic error, but refusing to acknowledge it. I'm hardly a suspect, Officer Winters, Marshall replied with calm dignity. I'm a serving military officer being illegally detained. The longer this continues, the more serious the consequences will become. Winters' knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, but he said nothing further. The police station came into view, a modern building of glass and concrete that seemed designed to project authority rather than service. As they pulled into the reserved parking area, Marshall noticed two significant developments. First, the local news van already positioned. Outside, and second, Sergeant Blackwell rushing to meet them with an expression that suggested mounting concern. The car door opened, and Lieutenant Simmons offered his arm to help her exit, a small gesture of respect that contrasted sharply with her handcuffed state. Uncuff her, Sergeant Blackwell ordered suddenly, his previous arrogance notably diminished. Sir? Winters questioned, confusion evident in his voice. I said uncuff her now. We're taking her inside through the private entrance. The change in strategy was transparent. They were trying to minimize public exposure. Too late, Marshall knew. The viral spread of digital information had already begun. By now, video of her handcuffing was likely circulating online. As Officer Winters reluctantly removed the handcuffs, Marshall rubbed her wrists, noting the red marks where the metal had cut into her skin. Though free from restraints, she was still being led into a police station under false pretenses, still being treated as suspect rather than citizen. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Officers stopped mid-conversation as she passed, recognition dawning on their faces. A heavy-set man in his 50s with a police chief's insignia hurried toward them, his expression a mixture of concern and calculation. General Marshall, I'm Chief Thomas Reynolds, he said, extending his hand as though this were a normal professional introduction rather than the aftermath of an illegal detention. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. Let's discuss this in my office. Marshall didn't take his offered hand. Chief Reynolds, I was handcuffed on a public street while in uniform, without probable cause or reasonable suspicion. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a violation of my civil rights and an insult to the uniform I wear. Reynolds' practiced smile faltered. Please, General, my office would be more comfortable for this discussion. Marshall nodded once, sharply, a commander acknowledging a tactical necessity rather than a civilian accepting hospitality. As they walked through the bullpen, officers averted their eyes or stared openly, depending on their level of self-awareness. Chief Reynolds' office was predictably adorned with photographs of himself shaking hands with various officials, certificates of commendation, and the American flag. He gestured to a chair across from his desk, which Marshall took with straight-backed military posture. General, I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience, Reynolds began, his tone suggesting he was already framing this as a minor procedural hiccup rather than what it was. Our officers were responding to a report of suspicious activity, and— "What suspicious activity specifically?" Marshall interrupted, her voice level but firm. "I was driving the speed limit in a registered vehicle while wearing a United States military uniform, with the rank of 4-star general clearly displayed. What about that profile suggested shoplifter to your officers?" Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "We had a report of a shoplifting incident and a description. A description that was so specific it identified a 52-year-old woman in military uniform," Marshall pressed. "I find that difficult to believe, Chief Reynolds." Before Reynolds could formulate a response, his phone rang. He glanced at the display and his face visibly paled. "Excuse me, I need to take this." As Reynolds answered, Marshall could hear the sharp, authoritative voice on the other end even without speakerphone. The chief's responses shifted from professional to increasingly deferential. "Yes, Governor. Yes, we have her here." "No, sir. No charges." "Of course, Governor. Immediately, sir." He had barely hung up when the phone rang again. This time, Reynolds actually stood up as he answered, as though the caller could see him. "Mr. Secretary." "Yes, sir. General Marshall is in my office now, and no, sir, no charges were filed." "Yes, sir, I understand the seriousness." "Absolutely, sir. Full cooperation." The moment he ended that call, a third came through. Reynolds now looked physically ill. "Madam Vice President." "Yes, ma'am. I understand completely." "Full investigation." "Yes, ma'am. Personally responsible." Throughout these calls, Marshall maintained her composure, watching as the local power structure that had so casually permitted her humiliation was now confronted with the reality of who she was and the authority she carried. When Reynolds finally set the phone down, he looked like a man who had aged years in minutes. "General Marshall, I want to extend my deepest apologies for this incident. You are, of course, free to go immediately. We'll provide a police escort to your meeting, and I'll personally ensure—" "No, thank you, Chief Reynolds." Marshall cut him off. "I don't require an escort. What I require is accountability. I want all body camera footage preserved. I want the names of every officer involved in my detention, and I want the original complaint that allegedly led to my being stopped." Reynolds nodded quickly. "Of course, General. Anything you need." "This isn't about what I need," Marshall said, rising to her full height. "This is about what's right. I'm a 4-star general with direct lines to the Pentagon, the White House, and Congress. I was handcuffed and nearly taken to jail for driving while black in Oak Ridge County. Consider what happens to ordinary black citizens without those connections. Have you ever been misjudged or mistreated based on your appearance? Comment number 1 if you believe what happened to General Marshall could happen to anyone in America today. Like this video if you think her calm response showed extraordinary restraint, and subscribe to see how this shocking story unfolds. How would you have reacted if you were in General Marshall's position? What about if you were one of the officers? Let's dive deeper into the aftermath of this unjust arrest and see how one phone call started an avalanche of consequences. The Oak Ridge police station's atmosphere had transformed dramatically in the 30 minutes since General Marshall's arrival. What had begun as a routine processing of what officers considered a standard detention had morphed into a crisis management situation that had the entire department scrambling. Chief Reynolds' secretary appeared at the office door, her expression tense. "Chief, there's a Colonel Rivera on line 1 from the Pentagon. Line 2 has the mayor. Line 3 is the state attorney general. They're all asking to speak with you, urgently." Reynolds looked like a man watching a tsunami approach while standing on the beach. "Tell them I'll call back after I've concluded my discussion with General Marshall." "They've all indicated they'll hold," the secretary replied. The implication clear. These weren't people accustomed to being asked to call back. Marshall stood, straightening her uniform with the practiced precision of someone who had worn it for decades. "I believe we've concluded our discussion, Chief Reynolds. I'll be leaving now. I expect those body camera files to be preserved and made available to my legal team by end of day." "General, please," Reynolds said, the confident authority he'd projected earlier now entirely absent. "Perhaps we can resolve this matter internally. These officers have families, careers. So do the countless black citizens who face this treatment, daily without the benefit of having the Pentagon on speed dial," Marshall replied evenly. The difference is that I'm in a position to do something about it." As if on cue, her phone rang, the direct line from Joint Chiefs Chairman Admiral William Hayes. Marshall answered with military crispness. "Marshall here." "Vivian, what the hell is going on?" Admiral Hayes demanded, his voice carrying both concern and anger. "I've got the Secretary of Defense in my office and the President asking for updates. I was illegally detained while driving to the Oak Ridge security briefing, sir," Marshall replied. "Handcuffed on the street despite identifying myself as a military officer. I'm currently at the Oak Ridge police station, though I'm about to depart." "Christ," Hayes muttered. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Bill," Marshall said, allowing herself a moment of less formal communication with her longtime colleague. "But this isn't about me. This is about a pattern of behavior that needs to be addressed." "Understood." "The Secretary is initiating a formal DoD investigation. The President has been briefed. Do you need anything from us right now?" "Just ensure the investigation is thorough and transparent," Marshall replied. "I'll call you from the car with more details." As she ended the call, Marshall noticed Lieutenant Simmons hovering at the office door, his expression troubled. The young officer had been the only one to show any recognition of the impropriety of the situation from the beginning. "Lieutenant Simmons, I believe you have questions about what happens next," Marshall said, acknowledging him with a nod. "General Marshall," Simmons began, his voice low and strained. "I want to apologize personally for my part in this. I should have intervened sooner." "Yes, you should have," Marshall agreed without rancor. "But you also showed more awareness than your colleagues. That awareness is useless without action, Lieutenant. Remember that in the future." As Marshall stepped into the station's main area, she found a dramatically different reception than when she'd entered. Officers who had earlier viewed her with suspicion or indifference now stood at respectful attention, their faces masks of professional neutrality tinged with apprehension. Officer Winters and Sergeant Blackwell were notably absent, likely pulled into urgent meetings with internal affairs or union representatives as the magnitude of their error became apparent. Officer Donovan stood in the corner, his earlier arrogance replaced by a sickly pallor. The front doors of the station opened to reveal a military aide in uniform, Captain Jessica Rodriguez, who saluted sharply upon seeing Marshall. "General, your security team is here. We've rescheduled the briefing for 1400 hours, and your staff has been notified of the situation." "Thank you, Mr. Secretary," Marshall replied. "But I'd like to focus this investigation beyond my individual case. What happened to me happens to countless Black Americans who don't have stars on their shoulders." "Understood, General. The President shares your concern. This incident has his full attention." As she ended the call, Marshall looked back at the police station with its gathering media circus, then at Marcus Johnson still watching from a distance. Two sides of the same American reality, power confronted with its abuses, and those who lived under those abuses daily. The Pentagon call had set forces in motion that would change lives and careers. But Marshall knew the real work was just beginning. The Eastern Command headquarters buzzed with unusual activity as General Marshall arrived the following morning. News of her detention had spread through military channels with lightning speed, and the public fallout was already substantial. 3 major networks had led their evening broadcasts with footage of her in handcuffs, creating a national conversation about police practices and racial profiling. Colonel Rebecca Walters, Marshall's chief legal officer, waited in the general's office with a team of military attorneys. Her expression was professionally neutral, but the tightness around her eyes betrayed her anger. "General, we've assembled the preliminary legal response team," Walters began as Marshall hung her cap on the rack by the door. "The Pentagon has authorized full resources for this matter." Marshall nodded, taking her seat behind the desk with military precision. "Thank you, Colonel. What's our current intelligence on the situation?" "The videos have gone viral, ma'am. Over 7 million views across platforms as of 0600 hours. The Pentagon press office has issued a statement expressing grave concern and confirming a full investigation. The White House spokesperson called it deeply troubling during this morning's briefing." Marshall considered this information with the same tactical assessment she would apply to any military challenge. Public outrage could be a powerful force, but it was also fickle and easily misdirected. The real work would happen not in press conferences but in detailed investigations. And the Oak Ridge Police Department's response? Colonel Walters' mouth tightened slightly. Chief Reynolds issued a statement late yesterday calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding and promising an internal review. Officers Winters and Donovan have been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Sergeant Blackwell remains on active duty. Predictable, Marshall noted. They're positioning this as an isolated incident rather than a systemic issue. What about our legal options? Captain Miranda Chen, one of the military attorneys, stepped forward with a tablet displaying a preliminary legal analysis. Ma'am, you have grounds for both civil rights violations under Section 1983 and a Bivens action for constitutional violations. However, qualified immunity presents the usual challenges. Marshall studied the analysis. Throughout her career, she had always preferred solving problems through systems and structures rather than individual actions. This situation would be no different. This isn't about me seeking personal damages, Marshall clarified. I want structural accountability and change. Colonel Walters, assemble a team to analyze Oak Ridge PD's stop data for the past 5 years. I want to know if there's a demonstrable pattern of racial disparity in their policing. Already underway, General, Walters confirmed. We've filed Freedom of Information Act requests for their data. Also, the DoD Inspector General's office called. They've launched an official investigation into the violation of a commanding officer's rights and interference with national security duties. A knock at the door interrupted them. Captain Rodriguez entered with a concerned expression. General, there's an urgent matter. The video of your detention has prompted a statement from the Oak Ridge Police Union. Sergeant Blackwell is giving a press conference right now. Marshall nodded to her aide, who activated the office view screen. Sergeant Blackwell stood at a podium, flanked by Union representatives and several officers in uniform. His expression was defiant rather than contrite. What happened yesterday was unfortunate, but our officers followed standard protocol based on a credible report of suspicious activity, Blackwell was saying, his voice carrying the righteous indignation of someone who believed himself wronged. General Marshall's military status doesn't exempt her from normal police procedures when responding to a reported crime. He's establishing their defense narrative, Colonel Walters observed, positioning the officers as diligent professionals, following procedure rather than acknowledging any inappropriate conduct. Marshall watched Blackwell carefully, recognizing the strategy. By framing the incident as procedural rather than prejudicial, he was attempting to shift the conversation away from race and toward a debate about police authority. Officers Winters and Donovan are exemplary members of our department with clean records, Blackwell continued. They're being scapegoated for political reasons, and the Union stands firmly behind them. Clean records? Captain Chen muttered. That's a testable claim. Indeed it is, Marshall agreed. Captain Rodriguez, contact that reporter from yesterday. Tanya Washington, ask if she'd be interested in looking into the service records of these officers. The press conference continued with Blackwell taking questions, each answer more defensive than the last. When asked directly about racial profiling, he bristled visibly. This department doesn't see color. We respond to reports and follow procedures to keep our community safe. Any suggestion otherwise is an insult to the badge. Marshall silently noted the telling phrase, doesn't see color, the common refrain of those unwilling to acknowledge how profoundly race-shaped American experiences, including interactions with law enforcement. As Blackwell's press conference concluded, Marshall's secure line rang. The caller ID displayed DOJ Civil Rights Division. This is Marshall, she answered. General, this is Assistant Attorney General Elaine Harper from Justice. We've been directed by the Attorney General to open a pattern or practice investigation into the Oak Ridge Police Department based on yesterday's incident and preliminary review of complaint data. That's good news, Ms. Harper. My team will cooperate fully. We'll need your statement and access to any communications regarding the incident. Also, General, the AG wanted me to tell you personally that what happened to you was unconscionable and the department is taking it extremely seriously. I appreciate that, Marshall replied. But I hope you'll look beyond my case to the broader patterns. This isn't about one incident involving a high-ranking official. It's about daily practices affecting ordinary citizens. After ending the call, Marshall turned back to her legal team. The Justice Department is getting involved. That changes the dynamics significantly. Before further discussion could unfold, Captain Rodriguez returned with an update. General, reporter Tanya Washington is not only interested, she's already been investigating the Oak Ridge PD for months. She has information about multiple previous complaints against these specific officers that were buried or dismissed. Marshall nodded thoughtfully. Invite her to bring her research here. I want to see everything she has. As her team dispersed to their assignments, Marshall remained at her desk, reviewing the security briefing she had missed the previous day. The work of national security continued regardless of personal challenges. It was a principle that had guided her entire career. The mission comes first. Her concentration was interrupted by another call, this one from an unknown local number. Normally, Marshall would have her staff screen such calls, but something prompted her to answer directly. "This is General Marshall." A hesitant young voice responded. "General? This is Marcus Johnson. From yesterday? The police station said they couldn't give me your number, but I called Eastern Command and told them it was important." Marshall's expression softened slightly. "Marcus, I'm glad you called. What can I do for you?" "I saw Sergeant Blackwell on TV just now," Marcus said, his voice tightening. "He's lying. Those officers, Winters and Blackwell, they've been harassing people in my neighborhood for years. My mom has filed 3 complaints. Nothing ever happens." "I believe you, Marcus," Marshall assured him. "Would you and your mother be willing to speak with my legal team about those experiences?" "That's why I'm calling," Marcus replied, a new determination in his voice. "After seeing what they did to you and what you're doing about it, Mom says it's time to stand up. We have documentation, videos, everything." Marshall felt a surge of respect for this young man and his mother. Standing up against systemic power required a special kind of courage. "I'd like to meet with both of you, not just for the legal case, but because I think your perspective is important." "Really?" The surprise in Marcus's voice was palpable. "You want to meet with us? Your experiences matter, Marcus. They're at the heart of what needs to change. Can you and your mother come to Eastern Command tomorrow at 1000 hours? After arranging the meeting and ending the call, Marshall stood and walked to the window overlooking the base. Below, soldiers of all races and backgrounds moved with purpose, each part of a system designed to protect American ideals. The irony wasn't lost on her, spending her career defending a country where she could be handcuffed for driving while black, even with 4 stars on her shoulders. Her secure phone buzzed with a text message from Admiral Hayes. "White House briefing in 30. President wants you there virtually. This is getting bigger." Marshall straightened her uniform, preparing for the call. What had begun as a routine traffic stop had escalated into a national conversation about race, authority, and accountability. As a strategist, she recognized the potential for meaningful change when multiple systems, military, media, justice, and public opinion, aligned on an issue. The battle lines were being drawn. On one side, transparency, accountability, and reform. On the other, defensiveness, denial, and the protection of a status quo that had failed too many for too long. It wasn't the battlefield Marshall had trained for, but it was perhaps the most important one she would ever face. The Eastern Command conference room had been arranged for maximum privacy and comfort. General Marshall arrived early, reviewing the files Tanya Washington had provided the previous evening. The journalist's investigation into the Oak Ridge Police Department was thorough and disturbing, revealing a pattern of discriminatory stops and excessive force complaints that had been systematically dismissed by Internal Affairs. At precisely 1000 hours, Captain Rodriguez escorted Marcus Johnson and his mother into the room. Vanessa Johnson was a poised woman in her early 40s, wearing a crisp business suit that suggested professional success. Her expression carried the practiced neutrality that Marshall recognized, the careful mask many black professionals developed to navigate predominantly white institutions. "Mrs. Johnson, Marcus, thank you for coming," Marshall greeted them, rising from her seat. "I appreciate your willingness to share your experiences." "The honor is ours, General," Vanessa Johnson replied. "And please, call me Vanessa. What happened to you? What we saw in that video, it's what our community has been experiencing for years without anyone listening." They settled around the conference table, where Colonel Walters and Tanya Washington were already seated, with documents spread before them. "Before we begin formally," Marshall said, "I want you both to understand something. This isn't just about gathering evidence for a case. This is about acknowledging a truth that's been ignored for too long." Marcus looked at the general with unconcealed admiration. "When I saw you in handcuffs, I was angry, but also, I don't know, validated. Like, if they could do that to someone like you, then maybe people would finally believe what's been happening to people like me." Marshall nodded solemnly. "I understand that feeling, Marcus. Sometimes it takes the powerful experiencing injustice before injustice is recognized as a problem." Vanessa Johnson opened a meticulously organized folder containing documented incidents spanning 3 years. "Marcus has been stopped 17 times in the past 2 years. No citations, no arrests, just repeated harassment. I filed formal complaints after 8 of those incidents. All were dismissed as unfounded." Colonel Walters reviewed the documents with growing concern. "These are extremely well documented, Mrs. Johnson. You've kept detailed records." "I'm an assistant district attorney in the neighboring county," Vanessa explained. "I know how the system works, how evidence matters. But even with video, timestamps, officer badge numbers, nothing has changed." Marshall wasn't surprised. Systems protected themselves, especially when those with power benefited from the status quo. "Tell me about your most recent interactions with Officers Winters and Donovan specifically." Marcus straightened in his chair. 2 months ago, I was riding my bike home from SAT prep class. It was about 7:30 p.m., still light out. Officer Winters stopped me, said there had been bike thefts in the area, and I matched the description. He made me prove the bike was mine, called my mom at work, kept me sitting on the curb for almost an hour. That was the 3rd time he'd stopped Marcus that month, Vanessa added, her professional composure momentarily cracking to reveal maternal fury. Same officer, same excuse, different days. Tanya Washington, who had been taking notes, looked up. "I've documented 43 similar stops in Oak Ridge over the past year. Young black males, often students, detained for matching descriptions of suspects. No arrests, no citations, just harassment under the guise of investigation." Marshall turned to Marcus. "How did these stops affect your daily life?" The teenager's eyes dropped to his hands. "I changed my routes home, started texting Mom my location constantly, stopped wearing hoodies or headphones, started carrying my school ID even during summer break." He paused. "I'm taking AP Physics and Calculus. I want to be an engineer, but those officers don't see that when they look at me. They just see a threat." The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled. This wasn't just about inconvenience or even humiliation. It was about a young person being taught by authority figures that he was inherently suspicious, inherently dangerous, inherently less. Colonel Walters broke the silence. "Mrs. Johnson, have you identified any pattern to when Sergeant Blackwell became involved in these incidents?" "Yes," Vanessa replied, turning to a specific section of her documentation. "Blackwell appears when there's pushback or questioning. He's the enforcer who shuts down complaints or escalates situations when officers like Winters are challenged." Marshall had seen this dynamic in the military as well. Problematic leaders who protected toxic subordinates, creating systemic problems that persisted despite individual complaints. Breaking such patterns required pressure from multiple directions, simultaneously. "Ms. Washington," Marshall turned to the journalist, "your investigation mentioned other families with similar experiences." Washington nodded, opening her laptop to display a spreadsheet. 27 families have provided statements about similar patterns of harassment. Most haven't filed formal complaints because they don't trust the system to respond. The data shows a clear geographic and racial pattern to these stops, concentrated in the historically black eastern neighborhoods and the mixed-race apartment complexes near Oak Ridge Community College. As they reviewed the evidence, Marshall's secure phone buzzed with an incoming message. "Excuse me," she said, checking the screen. It was from the Department of Defense Investigative Team. Oak Ridge PD internal investigation concluding today. Sources indicate all officers to be cleared of wrongdoing. Marshall shared this information with the room. It appears the department is moving quickly to close ranks and clear their officers. Vanessa Johnson's expression hardened. Standard procedure. Their internal investigations are designed to exonerate, not illuminate. Then we need to ensure the federal investigation has everything it needs, Marshall replied. Colonel Walters, arrange for all this documentation to be formally shared with the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division today. As they continued their discussion, Captain Rodriguez entered with an update. General, the military investigation preliminary findings have just been released. They've concluded that the stop constituted unlawful detention of a military officer and interference with national security duties. The report specifically cites clear evidence of discriminatory intent based on both race and gender. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Two investigations of the same incident reaching opposite conclusions based on who conducted them and what institutional interests were at stake. Marshall's phone buzzed again. A public affairs alert. Sergeant Blackwell is holding another press conference. He's organized a Back the Blue rally outside the police station. They turned to the conference room screen to see Blackwell, surrounded by supporters carrying signs reading, "Support our police and respect the badge." His expression was defiant as he addressed the cameras. This department is being smeared by political interests using one misunderstanding to attack the entire institution of policing, Blackwell declared. General Marshall is using her military position to pursue a personal vendetta against officers who were simply doing their jobs. The camera panned to show Officers Winters and Donovan standing behind Blackwell, their expressions carefully composed to project wronged innocence. This rally is about standing up for officers who put their lives on the line every day, only to be vilified when they follow procedure. Blackwell continued, "We will not be scapegoated for doing our duties." Marshall observed the performance with the analytical eye of a strategist. He's mobilizing community support, positioning the officers as victims rather than perpetrators. It's an effective counter-narrative. It's also complete garbage, Vanessa Johnson said flatly. Those officers weren't following procedure when they targeted you any more than when they repeatedly harassed my son. Marcus, who had been watching the press conference intently, turned to Marshall. "They're making it sound like you're attacking all police officers, but that's not what this is about, is it?" "No, Marcus, it isn't," Marshall confirmed. "This is about specific officers who abused their authority and a system that protected them instead of the citizens they harassed. Accountability isn't anti-police, it's pro-justice." As Blackwell's press conference continued, Washington's phone buzzed repeatedly. The reporter checked the messages with widening eyes. "I'm getting texts from multiple sources in Oak Ridge. Since General Marshall's detention went viral, people are coming forward with their own stories. The floodgates are opening." Marshall nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes it took a high-profile incident to create space for long-silenced voices to be heard. That was a responsibility she took seriously. "General," Colonel Walters interjected, "we've just received intelligence that suggests potential retaliation. Anonymous threats have been posted online regarding both you and the Johnson family. Security recommends increased protection measures." The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. Marshall had faced danger in war zones, but there was something particularly disturbing about being threatened in one's own country for simply seeking justice. "What kind of threats?" Vanessa asked, her arm instinctively moving around her son's shoulders. Colonel Walters hesitated, glancing at Marcus, but Marshall nodded for her to continue. Young as he was, Marcus deserved the truth about situations affecting his safety. "Primarily online intimidation so far," Walters explained, "but specific enough regarding home addresses and routines to warrant concern. We've also identified discussions in private forums frequented by police sympathizers suggesting making examples of those who attack the badge." Marshall made a swift decision. "Colonel, arrange immediate security details for the Johnson Sauer family. Captain Rodriguez, coordinate with local FBI to monitor these threats and identify their sources." Vanessa Johnson looked at her son, conflict evident in her expression. "We won't be intimidated into silence," she said firmly, though her hand trembled slightly on Marcus's shoulder. "But I need to know my son is safe." "He will be," Marshall assured her. "The full resources of Eastern Command are at your disposal. This is no longer just about civil rights. It's about protecting witnesses in a federal investigation. Do you believe threats and intimidation are common tactics used against those who speak out about police misconduct?" Comment number 1. If you think the system is designed to silence voices like Marcus and his mother, like this video if you admire the courage it takes for ordinary citizens to stand up against powerful institutions, and subscribe to follow this unfolding battle for justice. What would you do if faced with the choice between speaking truth and ensuring your family's safety? As we continue this story, we'll see how deep the corruption goes and what happens when powerful forces try to maintain the status quo at any cost. The morning light filtered through the blinds of General Marshall's office as she reviewed the latest security reports. 3 days had passed since her meeting with the Johnsons, and the situation had escalated beyond what even she had anticipated. A coordinated campaign of pushback was underway, targeting not just her professional reputation, but the credibility of everyone involved in exposing the Oak Ridge Police Department's practices. Colonel Walters entered without knocking, a breach of protocol that immediately signaled urgency. "General, we have a situation. Someone has leaked edited portions of the body camera footage to Watchdog News." Marshall moved to her computer as Walters pulled up the news segment. The edited video showed only the moments when Marshall had questioned the officer's authority, with her initial compliance and identification as a military officer conveniently removed. The accompanying narrative framed her as combative and uncooperative. "This is a blatant manipulation," Walters said, her usual reserve cracking with indignation. "They've completely misrepresented what happened. It's also illegal," Marshall noted calmly. "That footage is evidence in an active federal investigation. Releasing it selectively constitutes obstruction of justice. Track the source of the leak." Captain Rodriguez appeared at the doorway. "General, there's more. The Johnson family's home was vandalized overnight. Racial slurs, threatening messages. Local police responded but filed it as simple vandalism rather than a hate crime or intimidation." Marshall's expression remained composed, but her eyes hardened. "Where are the Johnsons now?" "Safe at a military facility as you arranged," Rodriguez confirmed. "But Marcus is shaken. He was supposed to take his advanced placement exams today." Marshall nodded. "Ensure he has access to educational support so this doesn't impact his academic progress, and double the security detail." Her secure phone rang. Admiral Hayes, calling from the Pentagon. "Marshall," she answered. "Vivian, have you seen the morning briefings?" Hayes asked without preamble. "There's a coordinated media campaign questioning your military record. Op-ed pieces suggesting your promotion to 4-star was politically motivated rather than merit-based." "I expected this," Marshall replied. "Classic discrediting tactics. When you can't defend against the allegations, attack the credibility of the accuser. The Joint Chiefs are issuing a statement defending your service record and accomplishments," Hayes continued. "But you should know there's political pressure building. Senator Grayson from Oak Ridge's district is calling for a fair and balanced approach that doesn't rush to judgment against dedicated officers." Marshall had encountered Senator Grayson at military funding hearings, a politician with deep ties to police unions and defense contractors. His involvement suggested the coordination went beyond just the local department. "Thank you for the support, Admiral," Marshall said. "I'd like to request something additional, a formal review of my complete service record and promotion history, to be made public. Full transparency is our best defense against these smears." After ending the call, Marshall turned to find Tanya Washington waiting at her office door, expression grim. "Ms. Washington, I assume you've seen the edited footage." "Yes, and I've received this." The journalist handed over a printed email. "Anonymous tip claiming you have a history of race baiting and making false accusations. They included fabricated incidents from your military career that never happened." Marshall scanned the document, noting the calculated nature of the lies, specific enough to sound plausible, vague enough to be difficult to definitively disprove. "They're getting desperate. What about your investigation?" "Making progress despite the pushback," Washington confirmed. I've identified 6 more officers with patterns of discriminatory stops similar to Winters and Donovan. And I've confirmed that Sergeant Blackwell has been named in 27 excessive force complaints over 12 years. All dismissed by internal affairs. Captain Rodriguez interrupted with another update. General, we've traced the source of the edited footage leak. The file metadata shows it was accessed from Sergeant Blackwell's department computer before being transmitted to a private email address associated with the police union's media consultant. Marshall nodded, unsurprised. Document the chain of evidence. That's another federal violation to add to the investigation. As her team continued their work, Marshall's attention turned to a notification on her computer, an invitation to appear before the Oak Ridge Town Council that evening. Mayor Richard Collins was proposing a resolution for a mutual acknowledgement of misunderstanding between the military and police department. They're looking for a way to end this without accountability, Marshall observed. A public handshake, mutual apologies, everyone moves on. She declined the invitation with a brief professional response explaining that with active investigations underway, such a meeting would be inappropriate. Within the hour, her office received calls from 3 council members and the mayor's chief of staff, all pressing for her reconsideration. The last call came from Mayor Collins himself. General Marshall, I understand your position, but surely we can find a resolution that respects both institutions, Collins began, his tone suggesting he was accustomed to brokering compromises, perhaps a joint statement acknowledging miscommunications on both sides. Mayor Collins, what happened wasn't a miscommunication, Marshall replied firmly. It was a civil rights violation captured on video and witnessed by dozens of citizens. The appropriate resolution is a thorough investigation and accountability for any wrongdoing found. General, with all due respect, this situation is dividing our community, Collins pressed. The police feel vilified, and certain political elements are using this incident to push an anti-law enforcement agenda. A small gesture from you could help heal these divisions. Marshall recognized the subtle pressure tactic, placing the burden of community harmony on her willingness to compromise rather than on addressing the actual misconduct. Mayor Collins, I believe what would truly heal your community is demonstrating that no one is above accountability, regardless of their position. That's the principle I've upheld throughout my military career, and it's what I expect from all public institutions. After ending the call, Marshall reviewed a new report from Colonel Walters detailing connections between Sergeant Blackwell and local power structures. Blackwell had served as security coordinator for Mayor Collins's campaign events. He was also first cousin to Councilwoman Patricia Delaney, who chaired the Public Safety Committee overseeing police department funding. The entanglements go deep, Marshall noted. This explains the political pressure to resolve the matter quietly. As afternoon faded into evening, Captain Rodriguez brought one more critical update. General, our investigation into the original shoplifting report has found something significant. There was no report filed that day matching the description officers gave for stopping you. The dispatcher logs show no calls about shoplifting in that area for the 3 days prior to your detention. Marshall sat back, absorbing this information. They fabricated the entire basis for the stop. Yes, ma'am. We've confirmed it with 3 separate sources within dispatch. The officers claim that you matched a description was manufactured after the fact to justify the stop. This development shifted the narrative entirely. What had initially been framed as overzealous policing or even unconscious bias now appeared to be deliberate targeting. The question was why. Marshall's contemplation was interrupted by a call from Vanessa Johnson. Mrs. Johnson, how's Marcus doing? Struggling but determined, Vanessa replied. He insisted on completing his AP exams remotely today. But General, that's not why I'm calling. I've received a job offer, a prestigious position with a corporate law firm in Seattle. Double my current salary, relocation assistance, immediate start date. The timing was suspicious. When did this offer come in? This morning. From a firm I never applied to. Vanessa confirmed Marshall's unstated suspicion. It feels like a bribe to leave town and drop our involvement in this case. Or a threat disguised as an opportunity, Marshall added. Have you responded? I told them I'm committed to my current position through the fiscal year, Vanessa said firmly. This is our home. Marcus has his school, his friends, and more importantly, running away would teach him the wrong lesson about standing up to injustice. Marshall felt a renewed respect for Vanessa Johnson's courage. We'll continue to ensure your safety. This type of pressure suggests we're making progress they find threatening. After the call ended, Marshall summoned her core team for an evening briefing. Colonel Walters, Captain Rodriguez, and Tanya Washington gathered in the secure conference room, joined by Department of Justice Representative Elaine Harper via encrypted video link. "We've reached a critical juncture," Marshall began. "The fabrication of the original shoplifting report elevates this from discriminatory policing to conspiracy and fraud. Ms. Harper, how does this affect the Justice Department's investigation?" The Assistant Attorney General's expression was grave. "It transforms the case significantly. We're now looking at potential federal charges including civil rights violations, falsification of police reports, obstruction of justice, and witness intimidation. I've been authorized to convene a grand jury next week." As they continued discussing strategy, Marshall's phone buzzed with an alert from base security. "General, Sergeant Blackwell is at the main gate requesting to speak with you personally. He's alone and says it's urgent." Marshall considered the unusual request. "Have him escorted to the visitor conference room. Full security protocols, recording active." 20 minutes later, Marshall entered the conference room to find Sergeant Blackwell seated alone, his usual bluster absent. He rose when she entered, not quite coming to attention, but showing more respect than he had during their previous encounter. "Sergeant Blackwell," Marshall acknowledged him without offering to shake hands. "You requested this meeting." Blackwell nodded, his expression unreadable. "General Marshall, I wanted to speak with you directly, off the record." "That's not possible." "Sergeant, this meeting is being recorded as part of an ongoing federal investigation." Blackwell's face tightened, but he continued. "Then let me be clear. You've made some powerful enemies, people who don't appreciate the military interfering in local police matters." "Is that a threat, Sergeant?" Marshall asked calmly. "It's a reality check," Blackwell replied. "This isn't just about one traffic stop gone wrong. You're challenging a whole system, and systems fight back. The smart play here is to accept the mayor's offer of a mutual resolution statement. Everyone saves face, life goes back to normal." Marshall studied him, recognizing the subtle intimidation tactic. "And if I don't consider that the smart play?" Blackwell leaned forward slightly. "Then this gets uglier for everyone involved. The Johnson kid, the reporter, your reputation. Collateral damage piles up. You've had a distinguished career, General. Why risk it all over one incident that ultimately no one was hurt in?" "No one was hurt?" Marshall repeated, her tone level but intense. "Every time an officer abuses their authority, the social contract is damaged. Every time a black citizen is treated as inherently suspicious, a wound deepens. Every time accountability is sacrificed for convenience, the rule of law is undermined. That harm may not be visible to you, Sergeant Blackwell, but it is real and lasting." She stood, signaling the meeting's end. "You came here hoping to intimidate me into backing down. That miscalculation reveals how little you understand about military leadership. We are taught to run toward difficult challenges, not away from them." Blackwell rose slowly, his expression darkening. "You've made your choice then. Remember this conversation when things escalate. You had an opportunity to end this cleanly." "No, Sergeant. You had an opportunity to take responsibility and be part of meaningful change. Instead, you chose obstruction and intimidation. That choice will have consequences." As Blackwell was escorted from the base, Marshall returned to her office where Colonel Walters waited with one final update for the day. "General, forensic analysis of Sergeant Blackwell's department computer revealed something significant. He accessed the internal affairs database minutes after your detention, downloaded complaint files related to Officers Winters and Donovan, and then deleted several records. Our tech team is working to recover the purged data." Marshall absorbed this information with growing certainty that they were uncovering something far larger than a single incident of discriminatory policing. "Notify the Justice Department immediately," Evidence tampering adds another federal charge. As night fell over Eastern Command, Marshall stood at her office window reflecting on Blackwell's warning. Systems did indeed fight back when challenged. She had seen it throughout her military career when pushing for greater inclusion and accountability. But systems could also be reformed when the pressure for change became irresistible from multiple directions simultaneously. The coordinated attempts to discredit her, intimidate the Johnsons, and control the narrative all pointed to one conclusion: they were making progress. The question now was whether justice would prevail, or whether the entrenched power structures would succeed in protecting their own at the expense of the public they claimed to serve. The Eastern Command briefing room hummed with tense energy as General Marshall reviewed the morning's developments with her team. 2 weeks had passed since her detention, and the situation had reached a critical tipping point overnight with a single anonymous act that changed everything. The complete, unedited body camera footage from all officers present during my detention has been leaked online, Marshall announced, highlighting the video playing on the main screen. Unlike the selectively edited version released previously, this shows the entire encounter from multiple angles. Colonel Walters nodded grimly. It went viral at 0200 hours, 27 million views already across platforms. The contrast with the edited version is stark. The complete footage told a dramatically different story than the narrative police supporters had been pushing. It showed Marshall's calm, professional identification as a military officer. It captured Officer Winters dismissively saying, "Another black woman claiming to be something she's not." It recorded Sergeant Blackwell's arrival and his comment to Donovan, "These people always think they're special." Most damning was the clear audio of Winters radioing dispatch after the detention had begun. "Need to get a shoplifting call on record for Oak Ridge Plaza area. Black female suspect, approximately 50 years old." The fabrication of the very justification for the stop, captured in real time. Public opinion has shifted dramatically, Captain Rodriguez reported, displaying social media analytics. Support for the officers has dropped to 17%. Calls for termination and criminal charges have increased to 73%. Tanya Washington, who had joined the briefing by secure video link, added her perspective. "My sources indicate the leak came from within the department itself, a dispatcher or officer who couldn't stomach the cover-up any longer. The police union is in crisis mode, and 3 officers not involved in your detention have come forward requesting whistleblower protection to share information about similar incidents." Marshall absorbed this information with the measured assessment of a seasoned strategist. "This changes our timeline. Ms. Harper, what's the Justice Department's response?" Assistant Attorney General Harper, also joining remotely, straightened her glasses. "The Attorney General has authorized an immediate expansion of our investigation to include potential conspiracy charges. Search warrants are being executed at the Oak Ridge Police Department headquarters and the homes of Sergeant Blackwell, Officers Winters and Donovan, as we speak." As if on cue, Captain Rodriguez's secure phone buzzed with an update. "General, the Pentagon is holding a press conference in 30 minutes. Joint Chiefs Chairman Admiral Hayes will be personally addressing your detention and announcing the military's formal response." Marshall nodded. "This is accelerating faster than anticipated. We need to ensure the Johnsons remain protected as this unfolds. The backlash against whistleblowers could intensify before it subsides." The press conference that followed marked a pivotal moment in the case. Admiral Hayes, flanked by the Secretary of Defense and Military Legal Counsel, addressed the nation with uncharacteristic directness for a military briefing. What happened to General Marshall represents not just an affront to a decorated military leader, but an assault on the values of equality and justice that our armed forces are sworn to defend, Hayes stated firmly. General Marshall's service record is exemplary, with decorations including the Distinguished Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, and 2 Bronze Stars earned in combat operations. Any suggestion that her advancement to 4-star rank was based on anything other than exceptional merit is not only false but dishonors the rigorous standards of our promotion system, the Admiral continued, his voice carrying the full weight of Pentagon authority. The Department of Defense has concluded its investigation and determined that General Marshall was subjected to unlawful detention motivated by racial and gender bias. We have referred our findings to the Department of Justice for potential criminal prosecution. Let me be absolutely clear. An attack on the dignity and rights of any service member is an attack on our military as a whole, and we will respond accordingly. As the press conference concluded, Tanya Washington was publishing her comprehensive exposé on the Oak Ridge Police Department. The article, titled "Pattern of Prejudice," detailed 37 cases of alleged discriminatory policing over 5 years, supported by department data obtained through Freedom of Information requests and testimony from former officers who had left the department due to concerns about its practices. The article revealed that black residents of Oak Ridge were 7 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white residents, despite comparable crime rates across neighborhoods. It documented how complaints against officers like Winters and Donovan had been systematically buried or dismissed without investigation. Most significantly, it exposed Sergeant Blackwell's role in maintaining this system through intimidation of complainants and protection of problematic officers. Within hours of the article's publication, Marshall's office began receiving calls from Oak Ridge residents wanting to share their own experiences. Captain Rodriguez established a dedicated hotline in coordination with the Justice Department to document these testimonies. "We've received 63 calls in the first 2 hours," Rodriguez reported. "Many with video evidence of encounters similar to yours. Several callers specifically mentioned officers Winters and Donovan." The momentum continued building throughout the day. State legislators called for an emergency oversight hearing. Civil rights organizations announced plans to file a class action lawsuit on behalf of affected Oak Ridge residents. Social media campaigns demanding "and justice in Oak Ridge" trended nationally. By evening, Oak Ridge Mayor Collins had scheduled a press conference, his previous calls for mutual understanding replaced by a new message distancing himself from the police department's leadership. "In light of disturbing new information, I am announcing an independent review of all Oak Ridge Police Department policies and practices," Collins declared, his political survival instincts clearly engaged. "The allegations of systemic discrimination within our police force, if proven true, represent a profound breach of public trust that must be addressed with transparency and accountability." Marshall watched the rapid shifts in public positioning with the detached analysis of someone who had navigated political waters throughout her career. "The mayor sees which way the wind is blowing," she observed to Colonel Walters. "Those seeking to protect the status quo are now calculating the cost of remaining aligned with it." The following morning brought news that the Massachusetts State Attorney General had joined the investigation, appointing a special prosecutor to review potential state-level charges against the officers involved. Simultaneously, the Oak Ridge Town Council announced an emergency session to discuss police department oversight and the status of Chief Reynolds. As these developments unfolded, Vanessa Johnson contacted Marshall with a significant update. "General, people are coming forward all over Oak Ridge. Not just black families, but Latino residents, college students, even some elderly white citizens who witnessed harassment of others. They're organizing a community forum at Oak Ridge Community College tonight. They've asked if Marcus would speak about his experiences." Marshall considered the request carefully. "How does Marcus feel about this?" "He wants to do it," Vanessa replied. "He says seeing you stand your ground gave him courage, but I'm concerned about his safety and the attention." "I understand those concerns," Marshall acknowledged. "If he chooses to speak, I'd like to attend, not to overshadow his voice, but to physically demonstrate support. With proper security, of course." That evening, the college auditorium filled beyond capacity. Families of all backgrounds packed the seats, united by shared concerns about policing in their community. Marcus Johnson approached the podium with the nervous determination of a young man finding his voice, his mother standing proudly a few steps behind him. "My name is Marcus Johnson," he began, his voice initially quiet but growing stronger with each word. "I'm 17 years old. I take advanced placement classes. I want to study engineering. I've never been in trouble with the law, but I've been stopped by Oak Ridge Police 17 times in the past 2 years." The audience listened in rapt silence as Marcus detailed encounters with officers Winters and Donovan, the repeated stops for matching descriptions, the demands for identification while simply walking home from school, the insinuations that his new bike or shoes must have been stolen. I started taking longer routes home to avoid certain officers, Marcus continued. I stopped wearing hoodies. I kept my hands visible at all times in stores. I became afraid in my own neighborhood, and even with all these precautions, the stops continued. As Marcus spoke, other community members nodded in recognition of their own experiences. When he finished, dozens of hands raised with similar stories to share. For 3 hours, residents testified to a pattern of harassment and discrimination that had persisted for years without redress. General Marshall, seated quietly at the back with her security team, observed the proceedings with both professional assessment and personal emotion. This was what meaningful change looked like. Not top-down directives, but communities finding their collective voice. Near the conclusion of the forum, someone recognized Marshall and asked her to speak. She approached the podium with the measured steps of someone accustomed to carrying authority. "I'm here primarily to listen, not to speak," Marshall began. "What happened to me was a single incident. What many of you have described is a pattern stretching across years. Your experiences matter, your voices matter, and most importantly, your demand for change matters." She paused, looking out at the diverse faces united in common cause. In the military, we have a concept called unit integrity, the understanding that we are only as strong as our commitment to each other. Communities function the same way. When any member of a community is treated unjustly, the integrity of the whole is compromised. What I've heard tonight isn't just about policing, it's about restoring the integrity of your community. As the forum concluded, Sergeant Blackwell unexpectedly appeared at the auditorium entrance, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers. The room tensed immediately. Marshall moved protectively toward Marcus and Vanessa, while her security team established a perimeter. Blackwell approached the stage, his expression unreadable. Camera phones raised throughout the audience, capturing the moment. When he spoke, his voice carried through the now silent auditorium. "General Marshall," he called out, "you've made enemies who won't forget this. This community was peaceful before you brought your agenda here." Marshall met his gaze steadily. "This community wasn't peaceful, Sergeant Blackwell. It was silenced. There's a difference." Blackwell's face flushed with anger. "You military types think you can come in and tell local law enforcement how to do their jobs. You don't know this community." "No." Marcus Johnson suddenly stepped forward, his voice stronger than anyone might have expected. "You don't know this community, Sergeant Blackwell. You patrol it, you police it, but you don't know it. You don't know me despite stopping me all those times. You don't know my mother despite dismissing her complaints. You don't know our neighbors despite entering their homes with your hand on your weapon." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Blackwell looked around, seemingly realizing for the first time that he faced not just Marshall or the Johnsons, but an entire community united against practices he had long defended. "This isn't over," Blackwell said, but the threat in his voice had diminished, replaced by the uncertainty of someone watching their power visibly erode. "You're right about that," Marshall replied evenly. "This is far from over, but how it ends depends largely on your choices from this point forward." As Blackwell and his officers departed, the atmosphere in the auditorium transformed. What had begun as a forum for grievances had evolved into something more powerful, the foundation of a movement for lasting change. The confrontation was captured on dozens of phones and spread across social media within hours, further shifting public perception. Blackwell's threatening approach to a community meeting, contrasted with Marshall's and Marcus's dignified responses, crystallized the core issues at stake for viewers nationwide. By morning, the state attorney general announced that Sergeant Blackwell would be placed on administrative leave pending investigation of newly surfaced allegations that he had attempted to destroy evidence related to previous misconduct complaints. The carefully constructed system of impunity that had protected problematic officers in Oak Ridge was beginning to crumble under the weight of accumulated evidence and united public pressure. What remained uncertain was whether this moment would lead to meaningful structural change or become another briefly acknowledged injustice soon forgotten in the cycle of news. For Marshall, the answer to that question would depend on what happened next, not just in public statements and press conferences, but in the unglamorous work of policy reform, oversight implementation, and community healing that would determine whether justice was truly served. 6 months later, General Vivian Marshall stood at the podium on what was once Oak Ridge Avenue, but had been officially renamed Justice Way in a ceremony earlier that morning. The street where she had been handcuffed had become a symbol of transformation, not just for Oak Ridge, but for communities across the country grappling with similar issues of discriminatory policing. Change isn't measured in days or weeks, Marshall began, addressing the assembled crowd that included community members, press, and officials from local, state, and federal government. Real change is measured in systems reformed, in policies rewritten, in new leadership committed to equity and accountability. Most importantly, it's measured in the experiences of citizens who no longer fear those sworn to protect them. 6 months since the community forum had seen a sequence of consequences that few could have predicted when Officers Winters and Donovan first approached Marshall's car that morning. The Department of Justice investigation had concluded with a comprehensive report documenting what they termed a pervasive pattern of discriminatory policing practices within the Oak Ridge Police Department. Officers Winters and Donovan had been terminated following disciplinary hearings that revealed long histories of civilian complaints. Criminal charges for civil rights violations had been filed against both, resulting in guilty pleas and sentences that included community service, probation, and permanent disqualification from law enforcement positions. Sergeant Blackwell had faced more serious charges after investigators discovered his systematic efforts to bury complaints and intimidate witnesses. His attempt to destroy evidence had backfired spectacularly when digital forensics recovered not only the deleted files, but metadata showing years of similar pattern and practice. Facing multiple felony counts, Blackwell had eventually accepted a plea agreement that included jail time and cooperation with ongoing investigations into department-wide practices. Chief Reynolds had resigned in disgrace when the full report revealed his role in facilitating the cover-up culture. His replacement, newly appointed Chief Alicia Ramirez, stood in the audience today, the first woman and first person of color to lead the Oak Ridge Police Department in its history. 6 months ago, I stood handcuffed on this street, Marshall continued. Today, I stand here to witness a community that transformed pain into purpose, injustice into action. This isn't a story about me, it's a story about what happens when citizens demand that America live up to its ideals. Marshall gestured to the front row, where Marcus Johnson sat with his mother. Now 18, Marcus wore the jacket of his university's engineering program, having earned a full scholarship that would begin in the fall. Young people like Marcus Johnson represent our future, bright minds who should be valued for their potential, not feared because of prejudice. The fact that he was stopped 17 times while simply living his life in this community was not just an injustice to him, but a loss to all of us when you consider the energy and focus diverted from his studies, his growth, his contributions. The audience nodded in agreement, many having heard Marcus's story during the community forums that had become regular events in Oak Ridge over the past months. The consent decree now governing the Oak Ridge Police Department represents one of the most comprehensive reform frameworks in the nation, Marshall noted, acknowledging the Justice Department representatives present. Mandatory body cameras, with automatic uploading to prevent tampering, civilian oversight with real authority, transparent complaint processes, data tracking to identify patterns of discriminatory stops, regular community engagement requirements. These aren't abstract policies. They're practical tools to restore trust between police and the communities they serve. What Marshall didn't mention explicitly, but what many present understood, was how the Oak Ridge case had catalyzed similar examinations nationwide. Following the viral spread of her detention video and the subsequent investigations, 27 other police departments had faced increased scrutiny, with 11 now operating under similar consent decrees. Reform isn't anti-police, Marshall emphasized, addressing a criticism that had been frequently leveled during the process. True reform is pro-justice, pro-community, and ultimately pro-effective policing. Officers who serve with integrity and respect benefit when those who abuse their authority are held accountable. She acknowledged several Oak Ridge officers in attendance who had been instrumental in supporting the reform process, including Lieutenant Simmons, whose early recognition of the wrongful detention had evolved into active leadership in implementing new training protocols. The most significant development, perhaps, had been the establishment of the Marshall Justice Initiative, a foundation created with Marshall's military retirement funds and supplemented by grants and donations that had poured in as her story spread. The initiative provided legal support for victims of discriminatory policing and resources for departments committed to meaningful reform. This foundation exists not to fight against police departments, but to fight for a vision of public safety that serves all citizens equally, Marshall explained. Already, we've assisted 300 families in documenting and addressing civil rights violations. We've also partnered with 12 departments nationwide that have voluntarily adopted transparency and accountability measures. Marcus Johnson had become the first recipient of the initiative's scholarship program, which supported promising students who had been affected by discriminatory policing. More significantly, he had emerged as an eloquent young leader, speaking at schools and community centers about turning negative experiences into positive action. "I'd like to invite Marcus Johnson to join me at the podium," Marshall said, stepping aside as the young man approached with confident steps, so different from the hesitant teenager she had first seen watching her detention 6 months earlier. "When General Marshall was handcuffed on this street, I felt something I'd experienced many times before. Helplessness," Marcus began, his voice carrying the assurance of someone who had found his purpose. "But what happened next taught me something crucial. Speaking truth, even against powerful systems, can create change." He described how the Marshall Justice Initiative had not only supported his education, but provided him with mentorship and leadership training. "I'm studying engineering because I believe in building things, structures, systems, communities. What we've built here in Oak Ridge over these past months isn't just police reform. It's a framework for justice that can be replicated anywhere people are committed to doing the work." As Marcus concluded his remarks, the ceremony shifted to its final phase, the unveiling of a small monument at the intersection where Marshall had been detained. The plaque read simply, "Justice is not automatic. It requires vigilance, courage, and the commitment of ordinary citizens to extraordinary ideals." After the ceremony concluded, Marshall and Marcus walked together along the newly named Justice Way, followed at a discreet distance by security personnel, a precaution still necessary given the threats both had received from those resistant to change. "You know, I never planned to become an activist," Marshall admitted as they walked. "Military leadership teaches us to focus on the mission, to avoid political entanglements." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the mission finds you, though. That's what my mom says about her legal work now." Vanessa Johnson had indeed transformed her career, leaving her district attorney position to become chief counsel for the Marshall Justice Initiative, leveraging her legal expertise to support systemic reform efforts nationwide. "Your mother is an extraordinary woman," Marshall agreed. "You both are extraordinary people. When I think about what might have happened if I hadn't been the one stopped that day, if it had just been another anonymous black citizen without the Pentagon on speed dial." "But that's just it," Marcus replied with wisdom beyond his years. "It happens every day. The difference wasn't what happened, it was what you did about it afterward. You could have accepted the department's apology, moved on with your life, treated it as an unfortunate incident. Instead, you recognized it as part of a pattern that needed to be addressed." They paused at the corner where a community center was under construction, another tangible outcome of the past months. The building would house after-school programs, legal aid services, and meeting spaces for community police dialogue sessions. "The work isn't finished," Marshall acknowledged, looking at the partially completed structure. "Policies can change overnight. Culture takes longer. Transforming the relationship between communities and police will require sustained commitment from all sides." "But it's possible," Marcus said with the optimism of youth tempered by experience. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have believed any of this could happen. Now I'm helping design community oversight systems as part of my senior project." As they turned back toward the ceremony site, a police cruiser passed slowly. The officer inside, one of the new recruits hired under Chief Ramirez's leadership, nodded respectfully to Marshall and Marcus. The simple gesture of acknowledgement symbolized the gradual rebuilding of trust that had begun in Oak Ridge. Marshall's phone buzzed with a message from the Pentagon, a reminder of her primary responsibilities as a military leader that continued alongside her justice work. "I need to return to base soon," she noted. "The president's security briefing tomorrow requires preparation. Back to defending the nation from external threats," Marcus observed with a slight smile, "while still working on the internal ones." "That's the thing about serving a country you love," Marshall replied. "You defend it not just as it is, but as it should be. The America worth protecting is one where the promises of equality and justice aren't just words, but lived realities." As they reached the ceremony site, now mostly empty as attendees dispersed, photographer Tanya Washington approached for one final image. The award-winning journalist had documented the entire Oak Ridge transformation, her initial expose expanding into a book that was already changing the national conversation on policing reform. "General Marshall Marcus, would you mind standing together by the monument? This image will conclude the documentary series." They positioned themselves beside the simple marker that commemorated not an ending, but a beginning, the start of a journey toward a more just system. As the camera captured the moment, Marshall reflected on how a single incident of injustice, rather than being buried or forgotten, had instead become a catalyst for transformation. The path from handcuffs to justice had not been straight or simple. It had required courage from whistleblowers within the system, persistence from community members who refused to be silenced, expertise from legal advocates who navigated complex policies, and leadership from those willing to stand firm despite backlash and threats. But most importantly, it had required ordinary citizens deciding that the gap between American ideals and American reality was not acceptable, and that closing that gap was a responsibility shared by all who claimed to love their country. As Marshall prepared to return to her military duties, she carried with her the knowledge that true patriotism sometimes meant challenging broken systems, that real leadership often meant amplifying silenced voices, and that justice, while never automatic, was always possible when enough people committed themselves to making it real. This story illuminates powerful truths about justice in America. First, it reveals how racism persists at every level of society. Even a 4-star general with distinguished service isn't immune. Second, it demonstrates that systems protect themselves unless challenged from multiple directions simultaneously. The most profound lesson is that true change requires both institutional power and grassroots community action. General Marshall's Pentagon connections created initial accountability, but lasting reform came through ordinary citizens finding their collective voice. Marcus and his mother showed that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about acting despite your fear. We also learned that documentation matters. From Vanessa Johnson's meticulous records to body cam footage and journalist investigations, evidence created undeniable proof of systemic problems. In an era of technology, truth has powerful allies. The story teaches us that accountability isn't punishment, it's the foundation of improvement. The reformed Oak Ridge Police Department ultimately better served its community by addressing its failings. Finally, we see that transforming injustice into progress demands persistence. Quick outrage fades, but structural change comes from sustained commitment to justice. The renamed Justice Way symbolizes not just what happened on that street, but the difficult path communities must travel to bridge the gap between American ideals and American reality. What moments in this story resonated most deeply with you? Have you witnessed or experienced situations where speaking truth to power created positive change? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If this exploration of systemic racism and the courage to fight against it moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that examine important social issues. Share this video with someone who needs to understand these realities. Thank you for joining me on this journey toward justice. And remember, in the words on that monument, justice is not automatic. It requires vigilance, courage, and the commitment of ordinary citizens to extraordinary ideals.